Hello, Ms. Yana. We are back again with Humble Hermeneutics. And just in case you missed our last session, we want you to know session. Let's start that over again. Section. Then we want you to know that what we're attempting to do is to come to the word, not as arrogant interpreters, but seeking to have some method of reading out of the text, observing it, and moving toward applying it in our lives and hopefully in your lives. So join us for our dialogue and our unrehearsed conversation. We're beginning the book of Esther. And for today, we want to just talk about what we see in the first one or two chapters. Yana, can you kind of summarize what sticks out for you in the beginning of this book?
Yeah. And so when we come to the book of Esther, kind of where we are in the timeline of Israel is that they have been exiled, right? And so, and many of them have been exiled and placed into other kingdoms. And so we come to Esther and we learn about this king.
You can call him X if you want, but Xerxes or
let's go with King X.
King X. Okay.
So we come to King X. And he's reigning on his throne, and he's throwing a party. You know, yeah. he's throwing a big, elaborate party. I mean, this is like Jay-Z, P. Diddy level nonsense.
I get to go. Okay, I get invited. Yeah,
yeah. And it's a 7-day party, and so King X decides that hey, he wants to flaunt his woman, that he wants people to admire her beauty because in his eyes, she is the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. And so he calls Queen Vashti to come out and flaunt her stuff. And she says, no, she refuses the request of the king. Now you can imagine that this hurts his ego, you know, like he the king, he been throwing a 7-day party, all his homies are around and like, you're not gonna come out, you know? But she refuses to come out. And so King X, what he does is he consults his councilmen. He consults the wise men of that day and says like, hey, like what should I do about the fact that Queen Vashti didn't come out and honor my request? And here's what these men suggest to him, that according to the law, what should be done to Queen Vashti, since she refused to obey you, your command, is that she should be removed as queen, and that she should be removed to give an example to the whole kingdom that women should obey their husbands. And the consensus was, if you let Vashti off the hook, then it's going to set a precedent for what is allowable in the home, right? And so King X is like, hey, I think this is a good idea. You know, it serves his ego, and it puts Vashti in her place, and with that, all the women in their kingdom. And so they send out an edict. Like, this is just how serious this matter was in King X's eyes, that they sent out an edict, letting everyone know that, hey, all the women should obey their husband no matter what. And so what sticks out to me in this passage when I look at it is like, so why didn't Vashti want to go strut her stuff? You know, like, what was it about the king's request that was so upsetting, you know, or that she felt like, no, I'm not going to do that. Because, you know, women, we like to strut our stuff. You know, like you
get to the point you don't have much stuff to strut, so let's find something else. But okay,
but you get what I'm saying, right? And so we like to be admired, we like to be desired, but it seems like Queen Vashti didn't want to be exploited, right? That she didn't want her beauty to be put on display, that she didn't want to be King X trophy. And so, yeah, I don't know. So that really stands out to me, that you have this woman in this ancient world making a very somewhat a political statement, in a sense.
Absolutely. Mhm.
And that she's putting her foot down, knowing that there's going to be backlash. Like she knows that there's going to be backlash, but she it's almost like she knows that she's not being treated like a human, and she refuses his request because she refuses to not be treated like a human. And so I don't know, that really stands out to me.
There's an interesting evolution in your thought where from what woman doesn't want to strut her stuff till obviously deciding that she may have felt very objectified.
Mm-hmm.
There's some nuances in the text that are just amazing. One is that we know this is a very serious time historically, as you have said, and the burden ultimately is going to be on her to do something to save her people. But it begins with this absurd, light, over the top, extravagant party. And I just wonder how often are we indulging in these frivolous things that are pervading the news when there are lives and the realities of people at stake. So there's a super contrast between the comical. I mean, it's comical to the extent that it goes on so long. The scripture suggests that he is heavily, I guess the word would be bibulous. Anyway, he's been drinking a whole lot. And he's feeling the juice at this point. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is at that point that he invites her. But she's not just sitting somewhere doing her nails. She has her own audience. She has her own event going on. And how often do we have our own life event going on, but we are expected to drop it to be a slice in someone else's? So that, there's no regard for the fact that there's a woman's party or a woman's something going on in the palace in Susa, which is the retreat home. So there's this disregard. And she does, I think, feel somewhat like, I'm not your eye candy. She must count the costs. And the costs apparently for her appear to be, I'd rather say no and risk being impeached, dethroned, or whatever, put out, than to be somehow subjectified. Now, it's hard to get the tone of what the author is saying. Is he really against Vasti? Is he really for Vasti? I just, I came to the text naively years ago and just felt like, okay, she's out. Maybe this is just a foil and a ploy to make room for Esther, because you got to vacate the spot to get Esther in. But eventually, I think it's much more than that. She is my heroine in the text, because she has her own audience and she appears to be content with that. There are some that writers have said have made up a reason, that there's some impression that since he says, come wearing your royal diadem, that maybe that's all he wanted her to wear before his heavily drunken companions or whatever. I don't think there's much support for that here nor there. But I agree with the way you put it. It's not timely. He's saying, leave what you're doing and come over here and be sport for what I'm doing and make my event. And there's something about us learning how to be true to our agendas, not in a competitive way necessarily with males, but knowing what it is the task in front of us. Now, maybe I'm making her much more of a political activist than she is, but I love this woman. I mean, I really love her.
Yeah, I absolutely love her as well. But here's the thing: growing up, when I heard this story or heard this passage preached, it was always about how Vashti was dethroned because she was not submissive, right? And that she
that's a bad word. I mean, I'm not saying that personally, but yeah, that word just strikes everything.
Yeah, and that she was wrong, that she was wrong in her decision to not honor the king's request, and that women need to be, like just even like exhorting wives to be submissive to their husbands. Like I've just seen this text used more so in that regard versus as seeing a woman who was being exploited and her standing up like for the fact that she is created in the image of God.
Now, I'm with you, because I think we're articulating the same thing. But then when I swivel my chair and I look at it differently, I wonder, when is it wiser to deal with the temporary indignation for the sake of maintaining influence. In other words, there's some roles that you and I probably could have protested, whether it was with professors or employers or whatever, but we would have been out of the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so at what point, and I don't know that we have an answer for this, but I'm just saying another way that I also look at her, and I don't think the author did all that. I think he was making room for Esther, but she's not a shallow character. But when I translate that, I don't want to be an always no person, because sometimes I need to hang in there for the sake of being able to share whatever, whether if it's just the missteps in my life or the benefits or the hindrances or whatever of the experience. So I think that, okay, this is risky. I always think about Martin Luther King. What a wonderful leader he was. All the streets named after him, all the schools, all the boulevards, all these things. But I'm quite sure, I don't know this, but maybe there are moments when his wife and his family put my back pillow out of, Mama got a back pillow, put it out of sight. There are probably moments when his family would have preferred to have him there, despite the good that he did. There are times that I wonder, should we not say no and tolerate what is clearly not just, it's an injustice, for the sake of maintaining influence for the future? I won't use the example necessarily that comes to my mind, but I can think of people who are not alive anymore and how I wish they had just endured a little bit more so we could have the benefit of their experience and their wisdom. And sometimes it creates a vacuum of a much needed voice. The other thing I want you to think about is how amazing it is, and this emerged as you were talking, when you were talking about the advisors to Xerxes said, you better do an executive order here and shut down all the women, how others see women sometimes with more power than we may see ourselves. So that's reading a lot into Vashti. Mm-hmm. But the assumption was that her one action could just send a universal ripple, because that was the world right then, that the Persian kingdom. And I don't know that we think of ourselves as people who really move the world with the choice.
Man, that's so good. That's so good. So your first question, being a Black woman who, went to a predominantly white seminary, who served in predominantly white churches, there's this reality that I have to navigate those worlds in a particular way in order to have influence, right? In order for my voice to be heard. And that has been a hard journey for me, to sort of pick and choose when to assert myself, to pick and choose when to ask questions rather than making statements. Always feeling like I'm in a position where I have to prove my intellect or prove that I have something worth listening to. And I've experienced when particularly white men or white women have experienced me for the first time, they kind of, defer to my male counterpart in that meeting, right? And then, I have to sort of find a way to be able to say what needs to be said so that we can move forward. And so one of the things I used to consult people in college ministry. And so there were times where it was like, Yana, you need to put your ego to the side for the sake of these students being reached for the gospel. And that's a hard decision to make, because it's like I shouldn't have to do this work, right, in order to be heard. Why? Because like Vashti, I'm a person created in the image of God, and I'm a person who's been saved by grace and who's been gifted with spiritual gifts so that I could, benefit the church as a whole. And so to have to go through these extra hoops has been difficult. But here's the thing that I've learned is like, I live in a fallen world. And so because of that, I live in a fallen world, but then in conjunction with that, God has created me to be Black and female. And that was a very intentional choice that he made, and that in that, like, I need to bear both the burdens and the joys, of being Black and female in America. And so sometimes I have to put the the um the goal, or put the interests of others before my own interest. And I have to take that same journey that Jesus took in dying to myself for the sake of others being able to share in the blessing of God's grace. And that's just been, it's been a hard journey. It doesn't mean that all the time I don't speak up, or that I don't, find the exit door, or things like that. But it's just a journey that I have to take. And really, that's where the Spirit comes in for me, where I have to choose sort of when to assert myself and when not, to do that. And I hate that that's the journey that I have to take sometimes. And so that's how I would respond.
Before you go to the second part of that about being seen as having a lot of power, let me interject something. Lest somebody who's listening to us, you hear that King James language? Lest someone think that it's always that male female, as with Vasti and Exertes. In the day when I started in ministry in the 70s, sometimes that opposition was from same race, same gender persons, because it was like, you are not meeting the expectation of what a Christian woman or mother should do or be or whatever. Sometimes that suspicion has come because of academics, that you could not really know the Lord and be on track because you read too many books, or you haven't read enough books, or you have too much demonstration of the Spirit, or you don't have enough demonstration of the Spirit. Or I've heard from people, I haven't had this luxury, who have said they've had to endure because of their physical appearance. They were so attractive, and Vastis present us as beautiful, till they got cataloged based on their beauty. So I'm not sure there's ever a journey. I hear you saying, I hate the journey. I do too. But I don't know if anyone has a journey that is not, certainly to different degrees, saddled by wrong expectations. However, it generally is not to the extent of where their life is at risk and where their livelihood is at risk, as we find very often among ourselves. So yeah, I don't know if we have time, if you can answer that power question, as being seen with more power and perceived as having more power than sometimes we perceive ourselves as having.
Yeah, that observation that you made is, I'm like, yeah, like apparently people understood how powerful Vashti's decision was, and how that could empower other women to make similar choices.
But do you think they would have? I don't know. Do you think she really was a role model, or do you think this was an overreaction?
It's hard to know. I think it's hard for me to know,
Yeah. Maybe not.
I can see some women, in the kitchen talking about some Vashti said no.
Yeah.
And so I could see that,
I get it.
and usually kings and queens set the precedent for how everyone else lives, and they look to them for a direction and those kinds of things. But so even then, she was.
Go ahead.
No, even then, she was a perceived threat, right?
So we might look to our own legal system and read it from a perspective of where there have been reversals in civil rights once granted, or other things in the law that are limiting, not so much that the suppression is really a metric of just how powerful we are perceived to be, that our numbers in prison or the refusal to give accurate history in our history books are an endorsement of who we are. There's a lot of identity stuff going on in this text. I don't know. Well, what do you do with this text? How do you ultimately, because we can land anywhere, how do you ultimately respond to it?
Well, you said something that was really powerful just then.
Let's talk about
And it made me think about how oppression is always it always is associated with power, that if there's some sort of power struggle. And we see that like even with the children of Israel and Pharaoh, right? Like he is concerned that power is going to slip from his hands, and so because of that he oppresses the Israelites. And we see the same in America, right? That people didn't get really concerned about the border or immigration. Maybe there were some concerns, but they didn't become really, really concerned about it until they heard that Hispanics will probably be the majority in America, right? That's when it was like, wait a second, something's gone awry here. We can't lose our footing. So like, let's go build a wall, or let's make stronger immigration laws and those kinds of things. So it's steeped in power. That's always the root of it. And we see that here as well. And we see that all throughout this book, Esther. Like King X is just really like power hungry. Anytime his ego is threatened or anytime he's presented with something that's gonna make him look more powerful, like he chooses his ego, every single time. And so that's one thing you said that just really stood out to me and makes me want to like go and think more about that and do some more research on just even how we see that in the multiple ways that people experience oppression, even now. But yeah, what do we do with a text like this? Queen Vashti for me sort of represents like not allowing anyone to treat you as less than you are, right? That if you believe that you are a person created in the image of God, then you in a sense move in the world and sort of demand that people treat you that way. And when people refuse to do that, like you don't entertain, them or their methods. And so when I think about the civil rights movement, I just got finished reading a book by C.T. Vivian. He talks about sort of the fivefold objective of the civil rights movement. And he says that the first thing that they wanted to do was to strengthen or redefine what it meant to be Black, right? That he wanted to build confidence in the people based on this doctrine that you are created in the image of God. And so because you are created in the image of God, you should demand to be treated as such, and not to be treated as a second-class citizen anywhere, because you are a human. And so I think that's what I get from Vashti is this courage to demand that people treat me as someone who's created in the image of God.
I probably have to come up to your level.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, I think we're justified in making that demand. Mm-hmm. I just think we have to be calculating about when we make it. Mm-hmm. I love it because the Bible's taken us to prison reform, it's taken us to education, it takes us to the civil rights movement and oppression and identity struggles. In this, trying to figure out what do we do with this text. I don't think we have to get closure. We probably agree with that because we can look at, that's why we're humble, because we can look at it from a number of different perspectives, and we can land in different places, and ultimately we try to decide. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am, I can. Mm-hmm.
And ultimately we try to decide what hearing of it works for us. You're talking about C.T. Vivian and those 5 principles or pillars. So let's look at civil rights for a moment, for oppression. When we look at people like Rosa Parks, I've heard her depicted as this little woman, this working woman. She's made a demand. You're not going to take my seat. I'm going to hold my place, goes to prison, goes to jail or whatever. But as history instructs us, that was not just a momentary decision. She had been through whatever training they offered for nonviolent resistance. So
Mhm.
she was prepared for that moment, which
Mhm.
suggests there were some moments preceding where she sat on Montgomery buses in the back. And I remember as a child seeing that sign. It was a little green sign that hooked on seats in Birmingham, and colored section was behind that. So she endured till a point. Um, but she was active in the NACP. I understand at her husband's urging. I just happened to talk to her cousin this week, or
Mhm.
her cousin-in-law, I guess it was, and she used to stay with them. So she had actually gone through training for a moment to make that demand. It wasn't she had the right temperament. Um, she had the make it home, get home again after I go to jail mentality.
Mhm.
Um, so it's not always that I got it right, I'm making a demand. And I'm not saying you suggest that, because you wouldn't be here now if you had demanded all your rights up until this point, whether it's
Amen.
in jobs or churches or with parents or anybody else. So there is some there's some mediation to that. But yes, at the core, we do have to figure out that identity. I mean, the first time I heard, I won't call a name, of one of our leading women preachers call Esther a tramp, I didn't hear anything else in the rest of the sermon, because that just rattled my cages. Like, Esther, a tramp, the woman that started pouring. But then the more I looked at it, I thought she was a little trampy. I mean, she was a little, and I wouldn't have used that word, but it helped me to hear. I was shocked into reading about her differently. I know we're talking about Bastille, and we can save that for the next discussion. But I was shocked into seeing more dimensions. I'll just leave it at that to our next discussion, to who Esther was or still is in my mind.
Yeah, I love that. Like there is balance. There is balance. I don't want anybody to think I'm just
Oh
like,
no,
but there is balance to that. And I
don't
think,
go out right now and throw that brick you feel like throwing
yeah,
and
don't do
burn
that.
that building.
Don't do that.
Tomorrow maybe, but not today.
Not
Think
today.
about
But I do think we see that balance in Rosa Parks, where
it.
she's like, no, you're going to treat me like a person created in the image of God, but she does it in a way that doesn't put her, in too much danger, or she does it in a way that allows her to be a mediator, and to bring about change. And if I don't
Have
know if
it,
anybody's
and they have another bus ride. That wasn't
and
her
have
last
another
bus
bus ride and have another bus ride. I just when you mentioned her, I was like, I want to highly recommend her autobiography to all of our listeners. It is a wonderful book, and you will learn that Rosa Parks was Trill from the young age of 5, 6, and 7. Like she just been about that life for a long time. And there are all these moments that built up to her being able to say no when asked to get off that bus.
While we're doing a commercial, let's put a few more names out there.
Yes.
Let's look at how Coretta Scott King sang and
Mhm.
raised funds for the movement. Let's look at Diane Nash and
Yes.
Selma, who's not given much credit for the Selma movement.
Mhm.
There's another name, I don't want to mess it up. Her first name is, I think it's Polly Murray, uh,
Yes.
and her role, a very gender inclusive woman.
Mhm.
Um, and let's not forget Ella Baker, if
Yes.
and who really put together if I'm not mixing my places up, SCLC, the stick
Mhm.
movement. Diane was with the nonviolent, and let's not forget who I'm forgetting. I can't think of the name right now. In Arkansas, that was the guide for the Little Rock Nine that desegregated the high school there. Um,
Oh, I'm not.
I can't pull the name right this second, but these were, and my favorite, all-time favorite, Love. Even she was to tell you how old I am. I love to tell how old I am, but she was a mentor for me in a group, not one-to-one.
Mm.
Where flew us to New York, expenses paid, and on weekend poured into our lives, Miss Dorothy Height, who
Oh,
sat
wow.
on the podium with Martin Luther King. But the women, and I just found this out, we're so out of Esther, but the women, okay, I'll call her Bastille. They didn't have much to say on the program in 1963,
Mhm.
but they had a march down Independence Avenue while the men were marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love it. And they all got there together and then had an after fact thing where the women could tell their experience. And the fact they didn't like it, they didn't get to share equally, but they didn't withdraw from the movement. Okay, that's my
Yeah.
banter.
Okay, I'm not gonna add my names. I'm just gonna wait. But well, I will add one. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes, ma'am.
Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, all these women who stood in the gap for us, like Vashti and Esther.
They were both. And maybe there's a unity to the personality. There's a part of me that's Vashti and a part of me that must be Esther. I think that's what we're describing. Not unique characteristics, but the blend of the two. Ooh,
that's good.
I got it. Yeah.
All right. Well, we
you don't want to see Vashti coming out, right?
No.
Or you don't want Esther to come out at the wrong time. But I need them both.
Need them both. Man, this is so good. I don't know if it's good. Well, I'm trusting it's good for our listeners because it's good for us. And I love how you said these are unplanned conversations, unscripted conversations. And so thank y'all for joining us today for our second episode of Humble Hermeneutics. And I hope that you will join us in our next episode where we will continue to be in Esther, but spend a little bit more time talking about Esther during that time. So hope to see you soon.
Thanks.